This is my story about my haunted doll, Claire. She has been featured in the book Haunted Objects, Ghost Stories on Your Shelves, several paranormal podcasts, and the TV show Ghost Towns, which aired on Destination America back in 2017. You can still watch reruns of the show on the Travel Channel from time to time. So at the age of 8, a very dear family friend, Mrs. Marion, gave me an old china doll. She kept finding things and she always gave them to me. And this doll was the last thing she gave me. I was never into dolls as a child, but I took a doll and put it in my room in a little baby rocking chair. The chair sat next to the dresser and next to the nightstand. Now the doll was really beautiful. She was wearing a peach and cream colored dress with an apron and petticoats. She had Mary Jane shoes that, when removed, revealed her delicately painted nails. Her body was soft, only her head, forearms, hands, and legs from the knees were porcelain. Her lips were pink and her dark brown hair hung in slightly curled, now loose curls. Her eyes were brown and her cheeks were pink and peachy, or like mine. Mrs. Marion said the doll reminded her of me, so she gave it to me. From the moment the doll, Claire, entered my home, things began to happen. I was always uncomfortable with Claire. I never wanted to touch her, and when I was playing in my room, it felt like she was watching me. It wasn't a cause for panic. But I just remember feeling like, if I did something wrong, she might actually say something about me or something. How funny that sounds, right? Anyway, the first real instance I remember was when I was reading in my room. Ghost stories, if you can believe it. When the musical merry-go-round, the horse sitting on my dresser just started playing. Not just a couple of notes, as old mechanical music boxes sometimes do, but as if someone had just wound it up completely. I sat stunned, and just watched the little grasshopper move up and down to the music. And then it just stopped. It didn't start, but just suddenly stopped. I was a pretty brave kid. I didn't run away and tell my mom. All through my childhood I would see a shadow man in the hallway or in my parents' bedroom door. And if she didn't believe me, she wouldn't have thought of something as common as a music box playing by itself, right? And so I didn't tell my mom and just let it go. For several nights and over the years, I have been awakened by what sounded like a woman inches from my face, simply screaming my name, "Jill, wake up!" I would jump up and sit down and just see that my room was empty. These events died down after a few months, and then she started torturing my younger brother with the same thing. And now that he and I have grown up and separated, she has actually moved in with my father. The little things started to get me too. I put something in a certain place only to find it on the floor, or on the dresser next to Claire. All my missing items eventually appeared near her as well. Immediately, a ring appeared in the pocket of her apron. Books fell from my shelves, and the smell of perfume sometimes filled my room. The doll itself did not smell at all, but the air around it did. My catalyst for finally getting Claire out of my room was the night I woke up after hearing a knock outside my closet. I opened my eyes, sat up in bed, and sure enough, my eyes were drawn to the nightstand where Claire was sitting. As I watched, the source of the knocking became clear. The rocking chair Claire was sitting in rocked on its own. I had a thick, shaggy rug, so it was no accident that it swayed. But if that wasn't enough, Claire's feet, which had been facing away from each other, slowly straightened and were pointing straight up. And 20 years later, that part still drives me crazy. She then turned her head, which was impossible to do as it was attached to her body in fabric. She looked at me, and all the music boxes in my room, 4 of them, started playing at the same time. I was frozen with fear, and I didn't feel in danger so much as I was just afraid of what was happening. I yelled to my mom and dad, and the music stopped, but Claire was just looking my way. And that's why I still hate dolls. Even after that, I couldn't completely get rid of Claire. I ended up shoving it in a box in the back of the closet. As far as I know, she's still there. Like the woman who is now screaming my father's name in the middle of the night. No, not in a fancy way. While I think she explains some of the weirdness going on in my parents' house, I don't think she has anything to do with it all, especially the Shadow Man. My friend Tim Weisberg is the host of the Spooky South Coast Paranormal Radio podcast show, and the author of. He asked me to lend him Claire as soon as he heard my story in 2011, and I agreed, and Claire stayed with him for a few months. He wrote about his experiences with Claire when she stayed with him in the book Haunted Objects that I mentioned earlier. Changes in temperature in the room she stayed in, along with audible voices, were two of his known encounters. In 2012, Claire also briefly stayed at the Lizzie Borden Inn. The guys from the Haunted Town show came across some things at my parents' house when Claire was with them, too. The guys from the Haunted Town show came across some things at my parents' house when Claire was with them. When I was working for a vegetable grower in Humboldt County, Northern California, I used to go solo camping and stuff like that. At that point, I had several thousand hours in the woods. But being an East Coast guy, I'm pretty paranoid. I always take my compound bow, not for hunting, but you know, just in case you need it. At that time, I had practically no gun permit. That evening, I built a fire in the tent under a rocky ledge. I smoked a cigarette and just chilled, and at one point I just dozed off, but I was woken up by something moving on two legs. I'm always up for a quick fix. If needed, I could leave my S-bag and tent and be out in seconds. However, I lay there for a few minutes just listening to what was making a wide spiral around my campsite, and it was slowly getting closer as well. Before I sat down, I determined the bug's exit route, and when the sounds were opposite the route, I grabbed my pack and bow and flew up to the ridgeline where I could get the best vantage point. I'm sure I was pretty loud, so everyone there must have heard me. I climbed to the top of the steep slope behind me, so I was sure nothing could catch me behind, and I lay down flat to see where I had just been. I lay there for several minutes, and could still see the light from the embers of my fire in front of the tent. A few minutes later, I saw something, either a man or something on two legs, pass through my camp between the tent and the fire. At that moment, I thought of putting the arrow down to try and hit her. But as this thought passed through my mind, a 40 or 50-pound rock fell about 5 feet from my head. I can't explain it, but at the time I felt it was a message. I felt that whatever threw that rock was much bigger, stronger, and faster, letting me know that I didn't belong in this place, and if anything or anyone wanted me dead, I would, and that obviously there was more than one, too. At this point, I dashed down the opposite slope and headed as fast as I could for the Ranger Fire Watch Tower, which I knew was several miles away. In my haste, I never found it, and to make a long story short, the rest of the trip was uneventful. As soon as I got home, I had a great story, and I told a few people, and apparently where I was, some Indian friends said that the area was off limits and I was clearly told to leave. I don't know if I believe them, but apparently the spirits of previous residents roamed there at night. Anyway, this is my story, and I still don't know what to make of it, but I guess take that as you will. This happened to me when I was about 15 years old, and I still don't know why it happened or what it meant, but even now it affects me as I am 22 years old. Near my house when I was growing up, there was a long gravel road that led to a cemetery on a hill. Right there on the top of the hill, in front of the cemetery, stood a house. I spent a lot of time in this cemetery because I would walk or ride my bike on the gravel and spend hours there just walking or sitting under the trees at night. Being so pleased with the wind and the quiet, I generally felt calm and safe there. Most of my family was buried there too, so it was nice to know it was my place. There were a few creepy things that happened every now and then, but nothing too serious, nothing too disturbing or anything like that. There was a quick jerk of a shadow behind a tree or a faint giggle or something, but I never felt threatened or scared or anything, even though I'm a big scaredy cat. What happened that day scarred me for the rest of my life, and so one day I got on my bike, and like any other day, I went to the cemetery. As I started to approach the slope where the gravel road turned into pavement, and before I could see the cemetery, I saw smoke. Strange, I thought. But I continued driving and immediately saw that the whole slope was next to the cemetery. Just beyond the fence that surrounds it, everything was burning, engulfed, completely engulfed in flames. I raced, dropped my bike and walked over to the fire, and I could feel the heat from the flames. It was very hot, and I heard a crackling sound, and the flame lay low on the ground, as if it had become grass itself. My first thought was that they must have burned some bushes or something, and it just got out of hand. In a panic, I jumped on my bike and rode madly to my house. After walking only a few feet, I looked over my shoulder and saw a solid black figure standing there in the midst of the fire. I could tell what he was wearing, and he looked solid. He was wearing a vintage-brimmed hat and I believe a shirt with rolled-up sleeves and suspenders, and he was holding a scythe or something. The old scythe mowed the weeds, etc. I could also see the heat from the flames, distorting the figure slightly in the hot streak. I felt like I couldn't breathe, and kept checking over my shoulder and then ahead to make sure I hadn't crashed the bike, and maybe whatever it was had hit me. As I drove quickly past the house near the cemetery, the man who owned it, who had always been kind to me, was sitting on the porch with his companion. He looked at me, having a good view of the scene behind me, mind you, and just smiled at me as if he saw nothing. I gave him a sickening look, and then looked over my shoulder again, and the figure was still there, now seeming to be slowly moving towards me. Tears streamed down my face, and I continued to stare at the figure until I was at the bottom of the hill and could no longer see it. However, I could still see the smoke rising into the sky, and when I got to the house, I dropped my bike and entered the house, and fell on the floor crying and unable to breathe. My parents looked at me confused as they ate dinner, and I tried to explain, but ended up telling my mom to get in the car and go to the cemetery with me. We quickly got into the car and ran out of there, and I was horrified, sitting in the back seat and looking out the window, and when we got there, there was nothing. No figure, no fire, no smoke residue, no burning marks on the grass, nothing else. Confused, I got out of the car and slowly walked over to the grass, where just a few minutes ago it was completely on fire. I touched the grass and cried again. I knew my mom or anyone else wouldn't believe what I had just seen or experienced. I was also scarred for a long time after that. I couldn't sleep, and I just didn't want to be alone for fear that whatever it was would come after me. I still think about it from time to time, and I have never seen or experienced anything like it again. My childhood was just a train wreck. I had a lot of emotional and mental issues, and looking back I see that my family had similar issues. My mother was mentally abusive, my father distanced himself from me, and I think I developed anxiety and possibly depression. School was going terribly, and I believe it was all influenced by a malignant paranormal presence. No one wants to hear about my dysfunctional family, so I'll stick to the paranormal part. One thing I have to point out, though, is that all of these things got better around the same time. The year I turned 15 and we moved. Nothing is back to normal, but my nightmares and panic attacks have become less frequent, and my mother has become less of a raging bitch, and my dad and I have reconnected over our shared interests in music, and other positive changes have occurred since our move. So growing up in this house, I had terrible nightmares. Night terrors were also the most common cause of panic attacks, and accounted for about 75% of them, I'd say. I hated sleep, and only got 3 or 4 hours a night, sometimes less. I'll briefly list the ones that showed recurring themes, as they may be relevant to all of this. Keep in mind, I was between 11 and 14 at the time, so in the first instance, I was in some weird hanging-style place, in cookie cutters that had been around forever and looked abandoned. The sky was black, but everything was clearly lit, and I was with my cousin, and a hooded figure was walking behind us a few yards away. We ignored it, and came to the house where my family was. However, once inside, my cousin was simply violently and spontaneously dismembered. There was obvious panic, and we all ran outside where we were all paralyzed and dismembered one by this hooded figure who revealed himself to be a worm-infested corpse. When I was dismembered, I woke up in a panic, and I was kind of loath to go into my parents' room, so I just waited for it to be over. At some point I exhausted myself and just went back to sleep. The second nightmare I had was my sister got pregnant, and both she and her baby died during childbirth. My parents took the miscarriage and treated it as if it were alive, and they were so engrossed in the dead child that they no longer responded to external stimuli, despite my best efforts. And although they were clearly alive, their bodies began to decompose and rot. Strangely enough, they all had the same decayed appearance as the corpse of the man from the last dream. The third and final nightmare I'll tell you guys about is I was standing by the pool with an unrecognized child next to me. He pointed to the pool, where a black-robed figure lay motionless, face down. It had been there for a while and was giving off this really nasty stench. The child jumped into the pool and sank to the bottom, at which point I started to panic and woke up. Anyway, you get the point. There were a lot of rotting corpses and black cloaks, and it was all just a throwback theme. Now, on 2 separate occasions, I can recall dark figures clearly appearing in the real world. One day when I woke up, a black figure just rushed unnaturally fast down the hall into my room and behind the window curtain. I lay there unwilling or unable to move for what seemed like an eternity, just hoping my parents would come rescue me. I finally got off my bunk bed and walked down the hall to the kitchen where my mother was eating breakfast. What was really strange was that I didn't hear her while I was in bed, and I didn't see her come into the kitchen. We went to my bedroom to confront the figure, but of course there was nothing there. The second time I woke up to a figure standing in my doorway, and she casually walked down the hall to the kitchen, and I did indeed follow her, only to find that when I turned the corner, she was gone. Every member of the family at the time reported seeing things out of the corner of their eye. Just stereotypical stuff. The lamp shifts, things fall. Figures moving out of sight were more noticeable, but they were much less common. My family seems to have erased that entire time period from their memory and just refused to talk about it now, except to my sister. I didn't insist on getting any information from them, but maybe I should try to talk to them. This incident happened sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in rural Ohio. There was quite a dense forest behind my house, and as a child, I had a passion for exploration, and I especially loved exploring these forests. It was my favorite place. Before this incident, I had wandered through that forest many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I often liked to climb, usually about halfway up so I could sit on one of the heavier branches and just relax, listening to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the first time was also a great achievement. From this position, I could partially see the back of my house. So that day, after a fair amount of research, I carefully climbed my favorite tree, sat on a strong branch, and took in the view. Naturally, in late October, the sun inevitably began to set within minutes. I was always a little sad to see the darkness approaching. The forest was like my own little reserve, and I could spend just a few hours there. And when it began to get dark, my mother would stand at the edge of the forest and call my name until I obediently returned home so as not to stay there after dark. After watching the sunset until I could see it, I started down the tree. I was almost at the bottom when I heard the familiar voice of my mother calling my name. I didn't think anything of it at first, because this routine had happened many times before. But then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice came from behind me, deeper in the woods, not at the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never been to this forest before, at least not with me, and I really wanted to find her and show her all my favorite spots before it got dark. Then I realized something was wrong. I mean, how could she go to the forest before me? Of course, I wouldn't have missed her, but as I said, she never went into that forest either. She kept calling my name, but there was something strange about that too. She sounded absolutely mad, almost angry, and fearing that I was in trouble for some unknown reason, I froze in place. As her voice got closer, I squinted to see if I could find her and determine exactly how angry or upset she was, but I didn't see anyone or anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, I heard her voice calling my name from the side of my house. This time it sounded much calmer, and after a few seconds it came again from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't an echo either, and I had no idea. I could literally hear her beckoning to me from the edge of our yard as well as ahead of me. My legs just suddenly turned to jelly and I couldn't understand what was happening. A voice that I originally thought was hers shouted from the front, "Come here now!" And I realized that whoever or whatever was impersonating my mother was now approaching. I didn't wonder what my mother's voice really was, because there was something about the way it sounded that made me really nervous. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I simply turned around and ran as fast as my legs could carry me to the exit of the forest. Honestly, It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house was not far from where I stood, this forest had never seemed bigger to me than at that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now also sounding really desperate. Panic set in when my real mother finally came into view and waited patiently as usual for me to return home. In my terrified state, I absolutely refused to look back. And as soon as I left the forest and found myself in the yard next to my mother, the second voice suddenly disappeared. Instead of going out, it just stopped the moment I stepped into my yard. I must have looked as scared as I felt because my mother asked me what happened. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided, but I didn't say anything until we were inside the house with the door locked. I asked my mother if she had been to the woods, and looking puzzled by the question, she told me of course not. With this confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she heard anyone else calling me and yelling, and the answer to that question too was no. Although I was still very shaken, I managed to explain everything that had happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly indifferent to the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time there alone. I still remember the incident in that forest. I can still hear the voice clear as a bell, and whoever called my name sounded exactly like my mother, but somehow I knew it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but her voice sounded strange, which I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back to those woods until I was 17, and then I never stayed there very long. I have looked carefully at all the possible explanations, but none of them seem entirely plausible. Of course, my mother wasn't kidding either. There was just no way she could do it, not to mention that she never liked to play pranks. I also highly doubt it was anyone else because, as I said before, we lived in a really rural area. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I was not personally acquainted with many of them. So how could they know my name and where to find me? We have since moved out of that house, but my mother and I discuss the incident from time to time. She still claims she never heard or saw anything out of the ordinary there, and I know she probably shouldn't have, but what happened in that forest continues to haunt me. I had spent many hours there before that day, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. The best explanation I have at the moment is probably a doppelganger or maybe a demon, but I'm really not sure. If anyone has a possible explanation for what might have happened, I'd love to hear it. Anyway, thanks for listening. When I was about 8, my brother, who was 8 at the time, and my cousin, who was 9, all stayed one night with my grandparents. My cousin lives on the other side of the country, and we don't see him very often, and he has some social difficulties. He is clumsy, never diagnosed, and very needy compared to me and my brother. We all lived in my grandmother's room, which had 2 single beds where my brother and cousin slept at one end of the rectangular room, and I was on an air mattress at the other end of the bedroom, which was directly opposite the bedroom door. My cousin got up whining that he was afraid of the dark, and my grandmother went upstairs and told him to go back to bed. She left the lantern on and the door half open, and we went back to sleep. I remember hearing the TV downstairs and my cousin being restless. I wasn't asleep, but I was just trying to sleep. Soon, and I remember because I was not yet asleep, though I began to descend, I saw through the very dimly lighted bedroom that all I can describe is that a goblin or dwarf about 2 feet tall hit the end of my cousin's bed, and I saw his silhouette run out of the room. He did not move the door, but simply pushed his way through the opening. I remember hearing his footsteps as he ran out, and I completely froze and just lay there, not knowing what I was seeing for a moment. My heart was pounding, my feet and palms were sweating, but I just froze. Seconds later, to my horror, my cousin got up and turned on the light, went downstairs to my grandmother, complaining that something had rattled on his bed. The whole time I was just lying on the air mattress, not wanting to believe what I just saw, and my cousin just confirmed it. My grandma came over and told him to stop being silly and just go to sleep, and I didn't say a word, but I know what I saw. 20 years later, and I still remember everything. My brother was a heavy sleeper all the time, and my grandmother still lives in this house, and I had night terrors in this house when I was little. But other than that, I don't find anything particularly supernatural about it. I have never experienced anything like it before or since. I talked to a friend about it years later and they said maybe it was a house demon or something. I just don't know. So, for context, I'm a 25-year-old female from the UK, but this story takes place when I was about 12 years old. I guess it starts with us moving into a new house, but the house, it wasn't your stereotypical creepy house. It wasn't that old and quite modern, but it didn't take long before we started to feel that the place was just a bit. It started off pretty tame, like the feeling of being constantly watched and stuff like that, but it soon escalated. To be honest, a lot of strange things have happened in this house, but I will talk about the 3 worst experiences. So the house was extended at some point. A couple of rooms were added to the side of the house. This annex upstairs belonged to my father and his girlfriend, and they also had a bathroom. The weird or stupid thing, though, is that when they built this extension, they didn't extend the attic, so we had the original attic over the old part of the house. But the part over my father's room was bricked up, so there was just an empty space till you could not physically gain access. Anyway, one night my dad and his girlfriend were just lying on the bed cuddling, or so I was told, when evidently they heard footsteps directly above them in the locked attic. 4 or 5 loud footsteps were heard, then some fighting, followed by a loud crash and the sound of a man making an ah, as if a man had tripped and fallen or something. And there was dead silence after that. But they couldn't look and see if there was anything there, could they? My father's girl was very mad at this point and threatened to go back to her parents. So the following is difficult to explain as the layout of the house is relevant, so I hope it makes sense. So down in the hallway we had this thick glass vase that my dad filled with glass pebbles and attached to the wall. I want to note that it was very securely attached. Apparently, since he had kids at home, he made sure to keep this thing nice and secure on the wall. Luckily, I wasn't home the night it happened. I'm sure I was staying at either a friend's or my mom's. Anyway, it's like 3 a.m. and my dad and stepmom are asleep until they're woken up by a loud crash. They open their bedroom door and see shards of glass everywhere. So they put on their shoes and go explore. And it becomes clear that our beautiful decoration was torn from the wall and then smashed. Like they actually ripped it off. It's like the screws were still in the bracket that held the vase, and they were huge long screws on the top, although there are shards of glass everywhere, literally in every room in the house. And of course, when you break something, the glass seems to go into the various places. But this was something else. In my bedroom, and I only had handfuls of large fragments. To get from the hallway to my bedroom, one had to go up a spiral staircase, turn right at the top, walk 6 feet down the landing, and turn right again. Somehow, all that glass managed to fly up about 12 feet and around 2 90-degree angles. And this is simply impossible. The last incident, and of course no less important, occurred in my father's room and in the bathroom. So my father had a lock on his bedroom door, and he didn't actually put it there. It was there when we moved. He didn't use it at first, but then my brother started bringing a bunch of his friends over at lunchtime. And soon my dad started noticing money disappearing from his room, so he started locking the bedroom door when he left in the morning. It was also a regular occurrence for a while, when one day my dad comes home from work, unlocks the bedroom, opens the door, and finds blood on the bedroom carpet. Obviously, he's like, "What the F?" and investigates further, and there's even more blood. It's like a trail from the bedroom door across the room into the bathroom, and there's more on the carpet and loads just smeared on the counters, the sink and the toilet, and everywhere else. Dad's obviously a little crazy, but he's trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. I mean, did his girlfriend come home at lunch and have an accident or something? No. Did my brother or I manage to unlock the door while Dad was at work? No. He even began to think that maybe the cat had sneaked up on a wounded animal or something the day before. Something. So he looked everywhere for a small bird or a rodent, but there was nothing. And we never solved the mystery of the blood, or the glass, or the man on the roof, for that matter. Anyway, I think we lived in this house for about 18 months in total, but the discovery came about a month after we moved. Dad is outside talking to a neighbor, and after a while she says something like, "Have you met your new friend yet?" At the moment, I don't think anything really crazy has happened, but we've already felt an amazing atmosphere at home. That's why Dad asks her to explain, and it turns out that a few years ago, a teenager died in the house. I believe it was leukemia, and he was sick for a long time, and they decided to just bring him home to die. And so soon his parents left, and since then no one stayed in the house for more than 6 months. Also, some additional random, fun, weird facts about this place. When we were decorating my brother's room, we took down the wallpaper and discovered that the guy had left a message under the paper. It's okay, but it was like, Bob Joe was here in 2001 or something, but it was still kind of weird because we knew who he was at this point. But we also learned from a neighbor that his family remodeled the living room for him when they bought him home, so he actually died in a very specific place in the living room. Absolutely the same place we put our snooker table, which my friends and I often turned into a den and slept under. About 4 years after we moved too, one of my high school friends moved and we weren't very close, but he knew I used to live there and that I had some amazing stories about the place. But his parents were non-believers, so it didn't bother them too much, and it turns out that between my move and his move, someone actually blessed the place, or whatever it was called, and that seemed to stop the madness. But my friend is still adamant that the house just isn't right, and he often feels on edge, but luckily they haven't had any weird experiences. And here is my story. I hope you enjoyed, and sorry if it was a bit long. I was small, 7, 8 years old. My mother and stepfather took me with them to visit a friend. The adults hung out in this guy's garage, and I had to play with the other kids outside. The only time we went into the house was when someone needed to go to the bathroom. I would never go there by myself because I always wanted my mom to go with me. The bathroom was at the top of the stairs, and the house was kind of old, and I remember it was a lot of fun because it had one of those lift chairs, and sometimes we had to ride it up to the bathroom. The chair belonged to the boy's mother, who actually lived with him. She was very old, with white hair, and always sat on the sofa in the living room opposite the stairs watching TV. She never spoke or looked at you when you came in, and I always assumed she was just deaf or senile. A couple of years ago, I was talking to my mom about this guy's house and how scared I was to go in there alone. I told my mom that there was always that old lady sitting in the living room, and she never looked at us, and it was very creepy. My mom opened her eyes wide and said, "What old lady?" Apparently, the boy's mother died a few years ago, before we started going there. But I know I saw her every time too, and I can tell you every detail of how she looked, down to her clothes, and the brown crocheted afghan she always wore over her shoulders, and my mother and I were very frightened by it. She also told me a story that day about how she was once in the upstairs bathroom in the same house, and heard someone come up the stairs and turn the bathroom door handle. She screamed for just a minute, then looked out the window to the left of the restroom and saw that everyone standing outside in the yard was everyone at the party. She zipped up very quickly and jerked the door open, but no one was there. I'd like to go back to this house when I'm an adult, but unfortunately the guy who lived there moved out, and we don't know the people who live there now. So I guess that's all the information I'll have get. So I was about 15 years old at the time, and I was living in East Tennessee, and I still am, but I digress. I really enjoyed walking through this forest because all the fallen trees, patches, and mud pits made for a fun little obstacle course. The other thing that will be important later is that I'm also deeply interested in the paranormal and the occult and things like that. They've never scared me much. So, I went into the woods that day for a short walk, as it were. This time, however, I decided to go a little further than usual, and my house was just out of sight when I discovered something strange. And this something was a part of the forest on which absolutely nothing grew. There were no trees, no moss, no grass, no mushrooms, or anything else. This area was also shaped like a large oval, and I didn't notice any flaws in its shape. There was no sign that it was man-made either, so naturally I just stood and stared at the strange patch of land. But it wasn't long after that things started to get a little weird. I started hearing some unnatural noise, and it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I could hear it right in my ears and from the forest around me, and it was getting louder too. It took me a minute to identify the sound, but it sounded like a group of women harmonizing. At least that's how it seemed to me. Now, up until this point, I was a bit excited, to be honest. and I was and still am in love with the paranormal, and everything that was going on was clearly not a natural phenomenon. I wanted to stay and watch, but I guess whoever was there was telling me to leave. Soon the harmonizing filled my ears as well, and it actually started to get painfully loud. Despite this, I remained steadfast in my intention to stay there. But then the strangest thing happened. I suddenly became very frightened, and without warning rushed back in the direction of my house. I slogged through the slush and muck, not even trying to jump past them, until I was back in my yard. As I stood there, covered in scratches and mud and blood, I realized that I wasn't actually moving my body. It was almost like I was on full autopilot or something. I mean, I knew very well what I was doing, but I wasn't telling my body to do it. I don't know, it's really hard to describe. But being stubborn, I actually tried to find the seat again, even though I was rightfully scared of it. But no matter how much I looked in that forest, I couldn't find that place anymore. This happened last week. It was around 11 p.m., and my city was in the middle of a severe storm with rain and cold nights. Just as I'm about to go to sleep, my wife tells me her van needs gas, and because I'm such a wonderful husband, I tell her I'll get dressed and take her van to the gas station so she doesn't need it first thing in the morning and in the rain. And what else? The streets are quite empty, and I don't go to the station closest to my house, but to the one further away, because it's cheaper there. It's been raining for a long time. Some of the streets are dark, and as I turn off the main road onto a side road that eventually leads to the second main road where the station is, I stop at the traffic lights. I just happen to look on the right side of the street, and there is a storm drain, and the water flows into the drain quite well, and that part of the street is not too dark, as the light from the intersection was illuminating the area. Now that I'm looking, I see a black figure crawling towards the storm drain. At first I think it's some kind of wreckage as it approaches the drain, but when I look and get closer I see it has legs, a head, torso, and arms. He crawls into the storm drain and lowers himself with his hands, holding onto the curb, and then just jumps up. I was like, what the hell is this? He looked bigger than a dog, but smaller than a child, I think. If I had to describe what I saw, I would say it looked like a monkey or something, maybe a fast-moving sloth. Either way, it was a humanoid, and it was amazing. Also, I definitely wasn't half asleep or drunk, and I know I wasn't imagining it. I also don't live in an area with a lot of wildlife. Just the occasional skunk, opossum, and coyote, and that's pretty much it. In any case, why would any animal just jump into a storm drain that has a lot of water flowing into it? It was strange, and looked like a human, but a tiny human, and I didn't know what to think. So, last Sunday night during the blood moon and lunar eclipse, a friend and I decided to drive up to this mountain, which is about 40 minutes from my town. We live in northwest Washington, right on the border in some rural communities. This mountain also borders an Indian reservation that I will talk about later, and is now used for logging, and has public access to trails and everything. So a friend of mine was on this mountain about a year ago, and he swears he saw something in the trees that looked like a man, but far away, and it was gone before he could look again. So, walking up this mountain, I was already thinking to myself, oh cool, I bet we're going to run into some Bigfoot shit or something, but I'm in awe of the great views, so it wasn't much of a problem. We reach this mountain and start climbing, and I immediately feel very uncomfortable, but I can't recognize. We probably spend a good hour on the road to the top, because for a small amount of time we get lost on side roads, and at this point, I just don't feel a good vibe. There was one spot in particular that gave me goosebumps. Usually, when I'm in a bad mood, I can kind of feel around me. I don't know if that makes sense, and I kind of understand where it's coming from, but this time I just couldn't pinpoint it. Everything around caused me such a feeling, but we got to the top and had to turn around because our fools didn't realize they had closed the top observation deck for the night and blocked the road with a gate, for which we are both very grateful. On the way down, I noticed that my friend was also visibly on edge, and he didn't believe in the paranormal at all, and thought I was full of crap when I told him about my experiences. However, we both just wanted to get off this mountain, and we kept seeing something moving in the trees, but we couldn't tell if it was the shadows playing tricks or not. It could very well be, mind you. When we were a good part of the way down, we stopped the car for a split second because there was a nice view from the road, and we wanted to at least see some view since the top was closed. So we stop, and we both hear this noise unlike anything I've ever heard. The sound didn't sound like any animal, and I spent the next day listening to different animal sounds to try to compare them, and nothing sounded like it. It sounded very aggressive and almost metallic, coming from right behind the car. Also, every time I was sure I hit something, my eyes start to water, and I kind of just cry, and as soon as I heard that sound, my eyes filled with tears, so I already knew something sad was going on. We both just look at each other, and we can just feel this thing. I have never felt so much evil and hatred in my life. It felt like he was right behind us, and he just felt very big and very angry with us. Honestly, I've never been so full of sheer terror. So my friend screams and he just throws it on the floor, and I instantly shine my phone light on the back seat because I felt like whatever was there was right in the car with us. I remember it was damn it when he decked it out and he said, "I don't know, but I never want to hear that again." So I'm basically sobbing while we're dragging our ass down this mountain, and I'm trying to calm us down by talking about my history lesson or whatever, and we finally reach the road and we're going home, and I remember him turning to me and said, "I know exactly what you were talking about." Now my friend is the biggest skeptic, and even he absolutely cannot explain what he heard and felt. However, we come back to him, flipping through his shit, and he starts looking at this mountain and the tribe that lives next to it, and I'm starting to wonder if his experience last year had something to do with it. And he immediately finds the local folklore of the local tribes associated with these creatures called stick Indians, which are malevolent forest or mountain spirits that resemble what we think of as Bigfoot. They mislead wayward travelers with eerie sounds, clicks, whistles, and more. However, I'm not too knowledgeable about this subject, so any additional information or ideas would be greatly appreciated. In any case, he is convinced that this is what we encountered, which certainly matches everything we experienced on this mountain. I also found a local post a few years ago about skinwalkers that detailed an experience very similar to ours on the same mountain. Now, let me say that I have no idea what we're up against, so this is all just speculation. I just know how scared I was, and usually when something happens to me I freak out for a minute or two, and then I feel good and think it's actually cool. But this time I wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. I'm actually still very terrified and having trouble sleeping because all I can do is think about what happened. Everything we both felt was extremely negative and really aggressive. Now, for the skeptics, we could certainly potentially be idiots and nothing supernatural happened, but I don't know about that. The fear we felt was more than just being scared of something. It was filled with fight or flight mode, and I was completely overwhelmed by the sensation of that thing, and I never want to experience that again, and especially never go back up that mountain again. Even my friend has trouble with this too. And like I said, he's the biggest skeptic I know. In any case, do any of you have any thoughts, or are we just idiots? Did we run into a stickman or something? The polka Indian theory makes the most sense to me since we were on a historic homestead, and maybe she was mad about her house being logged and just wanted us out of it, or something similar. Also, maybe the eclipsed blood moon caused a spike in supernatural activity or something. I don't know what it was, and sorry for such a long and meandering post, but I'm trying to figure it out as I write as well. Any thoughts, opinions, or similar experiences would be greatly appreciated. When I was younger, a group of friends and I went longboarding in a nature park near my house. This nature park had a lake that was bordered on one side by a path with lights maybe every 50 feet or so. We were standing maybe 2 or 3 lights from the end, throwing bread into the water for ducks, when we decided to leave. So we start kicking, and I'm at the back of the line when I turn around and notice in the last ray of light, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, a woman in a white dress with black hair walking towards us. She crossed her arms like she was cold. I stared at her for maybe 4 or 5 seconds when she looked up at us and then came at a dead sprint toward us. We start laughing, thinking someone is just messing with us, but we start kicking pretty hard. Now, it's important to note that if you push hard on a longboard going downhill, you can easily go 15 to 20 miles per hour. So we were all laughing or something when I turn around again, and this woman catches up to us. We had never seen anyone run so fast for so long, and we all panicked a bit and started kicking as hard as we could. At this point, we were going 20 to 25 miles per hour, and as we hit the last set of lights, I dared to turn my head again to notice that this woman was only about 15 feet behind us, and her features were really exaggerated. Her arms were too long, her hands were huge, and her fingers looked like they had extra joints or something. I couldn't see the details of her face either, but she was silently walking in step with my friends and me. The nature park had what we called a promenade that connected it to the neighboring areas where I lived, and we tried our best to. She was maybe 5 feet behind me when we hit the woods on the embankment, and as soon as we did, she just stopped in place, like it stopped instantly. No sound, no breathing, nothing. We went maybe 50 feet down before we stopped and looked at the thing, and it stood there for a minute, and then turned and went into the nearby woods. But then she crouched behind a tree and stuck her head out, watching us. Needless to say, we got out of there quickly. My friends and I only talked about it once, and my buddy, who was standing in front of a line of friends who were kicking, he kicked so hard to get away that he put a hole in his shoe. If any of you have any idea of what might have been haunting us that night, I'd love to hear it. I used to clean a house for a young couple I knew, and the husband worked out of town, and they had 3 very young children. I usually went in once a month or so whenever it got really bad. Now the woman mentioned in advance that some paranormal events are taking place in the house. What she didn't tell me was exactly because she also wanted me to come over at some point and clean the house. Yes, I clean houses, but I also make clearings. She was hoping to get some kind of confirmation that she and her family were picking up, but when I first cleaned for them, I did a walkthrough and didn't feel anything until I went down to the basement. There was a family room as well as a bedroom with a bathroom. Her 5-year-old slept in this room and created a total nightmare. A messy bathroom with toothpaste and chalk all over the walls and wet toilet paper all over the floor. Anyway, I felt like something in the bathroom was watching me. It wasn't an angry feeling, just wary. And I also felt like I was being watched in the family room, but it wasn't like the other room. And again, it was just wary. Other than that, the house felt good, completely clean and very positive. The woman confirmed that her daughter also always saw a black man standing in her bathroom, so that was confirmation for them. The woman also once saw a man riding a horse in the living room. The house was actually less than 10 years old, and the entire area was once farmland. So one day, a woman took her kids out of town for a long weekend, but she wanted me to clean. She hid the house keys in the baby wagon in the yard and asked me to be careful to put the keys back in the wagon, as it was the only set she had. I went in, cleaned both lower levels, then started upstairs in the master bedroom. I was cleaning the bathroom when I heard people talking outside the main entrance. The area was tiled with a large staircase leading up to the bedroom, so their voices could be heard and were actually quite loud. I 100% believed they were relatives of the woman at the time, and I heard them talking about her. They called her name and said she was out of town, and it sounded like one woman and 2 men. But one of the men also looked very elderly, so I thought her parents and grandfather were coming or something. The woman was the loudest and seemed in charge, and I heard them talking about me, and the woman said, "Oh, she's cleaning the house for Sarah." I also heard her say something about the house keys, at which point I placed them next to my purse on the small shelf by the front door. I felt really sad being up there with them standing there talking about me. So I took off my gloves and went downstairs to introduce myself. But when I went downstairs, no one was there. I didn't hear the door close or anything, and I didn't hear it open. The door was also locked, and the craziest thing is that there was supposed to be snow melting on the floor and just some trash. It was winter, and 3 people entering the house and standing in the entrance would leave a puddle on the floor. I was surprised and very excited about it all, and I wasn't scared at all. They felt fatherly and protective of the family, and I was happy to tell my client what I had been through. And so I went back upstairs and finished cleaning. However, when I went to leave, the keys were gone. Now I know exactly why I left them on the shelf next to my purse. In fact, whoever was downstairs seemed to have seen them too since he mentioned them, and I ended up spending an extra hour and 45 minutes looking for those damn keys. I called the ghost and begged the ghost and got mad at the ghost and tried to bargain with them, but all was fruitless. I didn't have my client's cell phone number, and only her landline, and the lock was deadlocked, so I couldn't lock it without the keys, and the back door was also deadlocked. I didn't have rooms for relatives, and I was beginning to imagine that I would have to spend the whole weekend staying in this house alone. At this point, I began to feel fear, not wanting to sleep there. And I don't know if it's just me or something, but it felt like maybe they wanted me to stay there or something. Although I searched everywhere and on all 3 levels, under the sofa cushions, in the kitchen drawers and cupboards, in the children's bedrooms where toys and everything. I checked the basement and bathroom thoroughly and even looked outside where the keys were originally and was about to give up when I thought to check the basket on the kitchen counter again. And there was bread and rolls in it, and at the bottom of the basket were some old leaflets. And the keys sat neatly on those leaflets under the bread. At this point, I got a shiver down my spine because I couldn't miss it the first time. I mean, there was a huge sticky flip-flop and a mini Tupperware container on the keychain, and you just couldn't pass it up. Needless to say, I got out of there and locked the door behind me, so relieved that I didn't have to stay there. When I told the woman after she got back, she said they often lose important things. Her husband does too, and it's more than her. She also said that her husband had heard the conversation before, but she had not. I still don't know what happened that day, but when the thought crossed my mind that maybe whoever was there wanted me to stay there, I don't know what it was, but I had this feeling like maybe they're trying to trap me in that house or something. So, I'm very skeptical of the paranormal, but this experience really blew me away, so I thought I'd share it. So I lived in a house that had 8 separate apartments. I didn't interact much with the other people in the building, except for the guy who lived next door to me, one of the nicest guys I've ever met, and the guy who lived directly below me. I noticed right away when I moved in that the guy below me was the opposite of a considerate neighbor. He would play music at all hours of the night, sometimes even 24 hours straight, and honestly, I could sleep up a storm, and it wouldn't bother me too much, except that it was just really gross. Anyway, I decided to keep the peace and not mention it. The guy who lived next door to me, Gary, came up to me one day and asked me if I didn't mind the guy playing music so loud below me because even Gary could hear it in his apartment. I told him it didn't bother me too much, and Gary said he was relieved because he didn't want me to run into the guy myself. I'm a 20-year-old girl, and Gary was in his 50s, so I think he was just looking after me. I asked why, and he said he met a guy years ago at work, and he introduced himself as John. But when he moved into the apartment, he introduced himself as Wes. Gary went back to one of the guys who worked with him to double-check, and he said he was switching between 2 personalities regularly, so he obviously had some kind of personality disorder or something. I'm hardly an expert on this sort of thing, but I heard Wes, which is the name my boyfriend and I ended up using to refer to him, yelling quite a bit. And I thought maybe he had the music on to drown out the voices or what. Maybe I'm off base because, like I said, I'm definitely not an expert or anything. Anyway, one day I find a note taped to the door, "Enough of your constant banging. I can't sleep." The handwriting also shows that he scribbled in rage. Now I was at work from 8 p.m. to 6 p.m., and when I got home, I spent most of the night on the couch. Obviously, I made some tea and went to the bathroom too, but I definitely wasn't knocking the whole time or anything. But Wes took it upon himself to start banging on the roof, my floor, whenever he felt I was being too loud or something. And that's how I know it wasn't me, because he knocked at the most random times when I didn't even move from the couch for over an hour, and sometimes like 4 a.m. when I was in bed for hours. My boyfriend knocked on his door several times, but he didn't answer. This is where it gets creepy. Now, I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, to be completely honest. I never thought about the strange sounds I heard in this apartment. After all, I lived in a building with 7 other people, and in retrospect, my boyfriend said some weird things in his sleep too, but anyway, he's regularly talking random nonsense in his sleep. Although I don't believe in ghosts, I found it very interesting, and I do have a Ouija board that I try sometimes. One night, my boyfriend and I decided to use it too, and we had already used it once in that apartment. But nothing happened. However, this time, Boy, it did. It's mostly a transition to random letters that didn't really make any sense. But I still got a weird vibe. I mean, the candles kept flickering, which I know sounds weak, but I somehow had a very strange feeling about the situation. But then, the board says, "Find me." So I naturally ask, "Where are you?" And it says, "Body wash," like an absolute idiot. So I read it, and hastily concluded that the board was talking nonsense, said goodbye, and turned on the light. To be honest, I was really scared, and I thought I heard something moving, and I didn't want my boyfriend to see how scared I was, because he really believes in ghosts, and I'm always very skeptical about it. It was only later, when I sat down on the couch, that I realized what it had actually said. Where is the hidden body? When I realized this, I told my boyfriend, whose reaction I found very funny. Nice try. To this day, he thinks I was pushing the board and making a fool of myself to make it look realistic too, but I promise I wasn't. Out of curiosity, I tried looking up local murders or disappearances, but couldn't find anything. I also can't find any social media for Wes or anything interesting about him online, and I've also managed to find out his real name. I still don't know what happened or why the council said that, and I'm sure there is a logical explanation. Maybe a subconscious move, but it scared the crap out of me. I actually moved out of this apartment a couple of months ago, and I won't lie, I haven't used a Ouija board since. I don't know if Wes's mutilated body is related to some kind of murder or something, but I just didn't let it go because it was so weird. I moved to a new place back in September and let my friend stay for a while, as we have recently reconnected. He was a childhood friend who was always in trouble, and we hadn't seen each other in years because of how much trouble he got into. However, shortly after the move, I was lying down and I could hear my daughter calling me. I went out into the hallway and into her room to see what she wanted. She was really fast asleep, and I thought that was weird, but didn't really think too much of it at the time. A week or so later, my fiancée was telling me that she had heard strange things and thought the place was haunted. My buddy said the same thing, and to be honest, I just laughed at them. Later that night, I was playing video games by myself, and some of the kids' toys started turning off by themselves, and it freaked me out a bit. If it was one or two, I would have thought one of them fell and they both went off or something, but it was pretty much all electronic toys. And after that, everything got very strange. While those experiences were terrifying and easily explainable, the next one couldn't, and it completely pushed me over the edge. The kids broke our TV, so I actually bought a new one, and I was in the process of setting it up, and I needed to open a package of screws to install the TV legs. I opened the package and remarked how stupid it was that they could only give us 3 screws when I actually needed 4. The bit holder on the shank of my drill did not fit, and I remembered that I had a handle mounted above the washing machine and cabinet. I went back there, and sitting next to a small set of bits was the 4th damn screw. And it totally amazed me. It was also very strange, and my buddy and I were watching the universe work, and my front door just slowly opened, and no one was around. Mind you, it wasn't windy, and it didn't open quickly, or even slowly. It was like someone had entered. Since then, we have often seen books just pushed away from the fridge, and often heard footsteps. My fiancée said she was really going to get someone to investigate, and my buddy started telling me stories about seeing himself, but with black eyes and other very strange things. Then I found out that he was actually in prison for manslaughter. In retrospect, he's actually a pretty awful person too. Anyway, he thought that everything that was happening was actually about us, and when we made him leave, it just stopped. Now what the hell binds a person? I am convinced that everything that happened had something to do with him. Stranger still, now that I think about it, we always had loads of little flies that never went away, and if he is not there, then neither are they. I try not to think about it anymore since it's long gone, but I really wonder what the hell could have been here. Thinking back on it too, I now wonder if everything around was trying to warn us about the guy or something. Anyway, those are the only paranormal events I've had, but it's very strange that everything just stopped when that guy left. So just a quick background on what happened. So on Christmas Day 2009, my grandpa did die in a nursing home. Due to the fact that there was a small staff on shift that day and no administrators, we were not informed until the next day. Burial and cremation took place in mid-January 2010. My grandmother planned to scatter his ashes near the river, where he liked to walk in his youth and other things. She also discussed it with him before he died, and unfortunately when the time came she couldn't bring herself to scatter his ashes, and so she put off scattering them for about 3 months. I remember visiting her one afternoon in 2010, and she told me and my mother that she was going to go down to the river that evening to scatter his ashes. She also wanted to do it alone, so we respected her wishes and left it up to her. I went home and didn't think much of it. But what happened next, I still can't explain. So that evening, I was sitting at my computer in the living room and noticed that the clock on the windowsill next to me had stopped. It was around 11 p.m., but the clock stopped at 10:20 p.m. I went to the kitchen to get a new battery for the clock, only to notice that the kitchen clock, also analog, had also stopped at exactly 10:20 p.m. Now these two watches were different sizes, different brands, and even had different brands of batteries inside. To be honest, they weren't radio-controlled or controlled in any way, and feeling a bit scared, I went upstairs to wake up my girlfriend at the time, who was going to bed early, and told her about this strange thing that had happened. And then I noticed that the clock on the bedside table also stopped, exactly at 22.20, analog, battery-powered, and again different from the other two. So at this point I think one clock stopped is unfortunate, 2 is a coincidence, but 3 is beyond anything I can fathom. So I went looking for a clock all over the house, and the only other one I could find was in our son's room. At the time, our son was only 8 weeks old and still sleeping in a crib in our bedroom, but we were getting ready for his bedroom when he was a little older, and the clock in his room was on the shelf and had a design of a character from some children's cartoon, and that one also stopped at 22.20. So by now, I'm obviously more than scared. I replaced all the batteries, and the watch started working fine again. And this has never happened again. Only a couple of weeks later, I visited my grandmother again, and she explained that she had gone and scattered my grandfather's ashes the day I last saw her. I had not mentioned the case of the watches, but it occurred to me, and I asked her when she had gone down to scatter those ashes by the river, and she told me she was out quite late, but she said it was supposed to be shortly before 10:30 p.m. At this point, a chill ran down my spine as I wondered if this had anything to do with what happened with those watches. I didn't tell her about the watch because I didn't want to scare her, and apparently my grandfather played with some black magic once and it scared the hell out of her, so I knew she was scared of things like that. But I told my mother, and although she believed me, it didn't bother her that much, because she said she saw and heard my grandfather in the house until his ashes were scattered. I live in a pretty rough neighborhood. I have 4 other housemates, but they are all away for the holiday season. We are students. For Christmas, I was given one of those doorbells that have a camera in them. I attached it to the frame on the outside of my door, which looks out onto the old pub, and it took a few days, and then the postman rang the doorbell, which was nice, and it worked. However, a couple of days later, on my way home from work, I noticed that the bell had been stolen. I hadn't even thought about it, but of course it had to be stolen, right? I was annoyed, but not surprised by what I mean. But this is where it gets scary. Last night my phone rang at the door. It was very late and I was still alone in the house, but the screen was dark and it was just a picture of my house, which meant that the person who stole it was sitting outside filming my house on my own doorbell. I was very moved by this. The terrain is quite rough, and I have been attacked and robbed before. Vidaris quickly turned black, as if the culprit had put the doorbell in his pocket or something. I peeked through the curtain to where I thought the man was renting the house, but no one was there.